had the Roman Catholic Church is still around, right? And then you had the Holy Roman Empire that didn't fall really until World War One either. So it's sort of funny that, like the history of World War One was like a turning point in that regard, if you think about it.
Yeah, I think this thing is extremely nuanced. I think it's definitely going to get clickbait, this type of topic, but I really think that Islam and Judaism have really a lot in common with each other.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's really weird when people are like, they're so different. Usually both parties are kind of ignorant of the other position.
Yeah, you're muted. And the Holy Roman
Sorry,
Empire
yeah.
fell in 1806. Sorry, people. So I'm a century off, just to clarify that. But
Well, we're not perfect. I know, me too. It's like sometimes we can't memorize every single fact. We're human, you know?
I know. But yeah, I agree. Like I went to the Middle East, and I saw like bigotry on both sides when I was in Israel, and I went to bars and stuff like that. I spoke to people because I like talking to people, and like there was bigotry against Muslims. Like they had apartheid laws. How they treated the occupied territories were different than how they treated the rest of the citizens of Israel. And doing that for decades is going to create animosity. It's going to create like hatred towards your government. And the Oslo Accords were an attempt to fix that. But then you got this landlocked territory on the West Bank. But West Bank doesn't have the problems that the Gaza Strip does because of Muslim Brotherhood, I would argue, but or
Say that one more
Hamas.
time.
Um, I was going to say, like they had like apartheid laws, how they treated the occupied territories before the Oslo Accords, and even after the Oslo Accords, they still like treat them differently. But the West Bank doesn't have the same type of problems as the Gaza Strip does, and I would say that's because of the Muslim Brotherhood and how it converted into Hamas and stuff like that, created more animosity there. But even there, you don't have the potential for trade and stuff like that between those two countries. If they were going to do it, maybe they should have done a three-state solution. Like, how do you govern these two different regions that are separated by Israel? Like,
Yeah, I hear that, and I think a big problem that we need to look at is the concept of a nation state. A lot of people are not looking at that. I'm like, what Israel's doing is not really unique for nation states. I mean, like when you think of 10/7, 9/11, it was the same response. So I do think that's when people can bring in anti-Semitism when they're saying, well, look, Jews are uniquely these horrible people that do these things. I'm like, that's deeply problematic. Um, yeah, I have a difficulty with what Threatened Sanity is saying about it being religious. I there's so many different perspectives of religion. I feel like when you go and study religion in a graduate school, you can find out there's multiple perspectives of what religion has to offer. So some people may use that as justification for what they're doing, but a lot of the time it really links to a political stuff, and religion is a part of that catalyst, the link towards um, it's a kind of a marriage between both the politics and a religious interpretation, I would say.
right. So let's
We
talk
need
about the debate. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
Finish.
No, please.
I was going to say. I was going to say maybe we can make it a little juicy. What do you think about the debaters? Do you think we'll see some fireworks going off because you got AP versus Daniel, dude? Like, not that they haven't debated before. I think they have debated before, but
They have, I'm sure.
doesn't
Um,
Daniel like to insult AP a little bit? If memory serves.
yeah, I mean, it's the usual same. It's the usual suspects. Thinking about both of these debaters, they have both have very strong positions and both very strong opinions in this situation. Yeah, I see the point of what the person is saying. Islamic fundamentalism. I would call it Islamic extremism. I wouldn't call it fundamentalism because that you would have to then prove that it's the fundamentals. And I already have argued that I would argue Islam, like all religions, is polyolithic, not monolithic. but that's besides the point. Just answering that what that person is saying. But I think both of these debaters have very strong feelings and strong opinions. Um, I'm very. I saw what Max said about dumpster fire. It's quite possible that is what it's going to be a big fight. Um, I think that it's going to be intense because they both have very strong personalities. I think it's the most neutral way to put it.
Yeah, I think so too. I think AP is a little bit more soft spoken, but he will push back. I think Daniel's much more aggressive. I think in his rhetoric, but I don't know. Like I
I
would
agree.
say AP is probably going to have the better argument. Daniel's going to appeal more to his religious doctrine and emotion than AP will. I'm surprised actually that because I don't see a lot of atheists defending Israel in this conflict. So I'm happy to see AP doing that. Like, because I think it's important that, but I don't think he's going to attack Muslims in general. He's going to attack the Hamas and the principles and concepts that how Hamas is interpreting in Islam um, to support their goals. Hopefully, maybe that's what he's going to attack is how Hamas interprets the text.
I'm going to tell you one thing that I know. Daniel's going to get Judaism wrong. He doesn't know anything about Judaism. He's going to get it completely wrong. He has not done the work. He couldn't even pronounce the name of the Rambam, like one of the greatest authorities in Judaism, correctly. And I would say, yes, Pharisaic Jewish thought that we have now. But, you know, Rabbi Moses Maimonides is like one of the greatest rabbis within the Jewish tradition. He did not represent him correctly. He doesn't understand his thought, and that's just going to be awful. I think that's just going to be terrible, personally. His point on Judaism, because the point is he has to say which caused it, so he's going to have to throw Judaism under the bus, which is very problematic, I think, for any Muslim, because Islam requires Judaism. So if you try to
Yes.
throw Judaism under the bus, and I see a lot of Muslims do this in debates, and I think it's disgusting. You try to throw Judaism and Christianity under the bus, well, then you throw Islam under the bus. So I'm like, just don't do it. Don't do it. It theologically
Yeah.
destroys you. It hurts your point of view, and it makes what you're saying not work. So, but he's going to do it, and I'm almost sure he's going to throw Judaism, Christianity. He's going to throw them all under the bus, even though he wants to live under their supremacist state. That's what he said. I'd rather live under a Jewish supremacist state than a secular supremacist state.
Of
Remember? That's
course he
his
would.
position.
But
Even though we live
it's
under
not
a
a
secular state, and it's pretty good.
but Israel is a secular state, sort
It
of.
is.
I mean, they do have like where if you're of Jewish descent, you can become a citizen. You get fast tracked to citizenship, which I talked about in the beginning. I don't necessarily agree with, but I understand why they do it. Um,
But I think it is problematic because I would say probably most Palestinians are Jewish, like ethnically speaking.
oh yeah, but I would
Yeah,
say
yeah.
when if I ever do theological debates against Christianity or Islam, a lot of times I will like pick apart Judaism to show how Judaism is false. So if Judaism is false, then Christianity and Islam also must be false. And people don't like that. It's like, well, you're attacking Yeah, I am. That's the fun. That's a root. Like I'm attacking that text to show that why I don't
You
believe
would
it's
have to.
true.
If you're
Yeah,
taking that position, you would have to. That's a fair analysis. Judaism is completely intermarried with Christianity and Islam. And I see
yeah.
Christians and Muslims try to act like it's not. And it doesn't work for them.
Hmm.
Because once you actually study Judaism, you say, oh, well, I'm believing in Hebrew prophets. But then people say, well, they're not actually Hebrew. Like Muslims will say, well, geez, like we have Imam Bomer's position where he said, well, they are actually, Jesus is a Muslim. You know, people are saying he's a Muslim. And I'm like, that's fascinating. So how do you define what a Muslim is? Well, a Muslim is a person who submits to God. And I'm like, okay, well, is
Oh
David Wood
yeah,
a Muslim? Is Dr. Wood a Muslim? I'm like,
that was a
imagine how you
horrible
love that.
argument.
But a lot
Yeah.
of people believe in it, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. If you're going to say everyone's, then you have this very open, very inclusive position for Islam. And I'm like, if you want to take that position, be consistent with it. Then you got to say everybody's Muslim. Then you know we can even argue atheists are Muslim too.
Yeah,
We
I've
can make
been
that argument.
told that. I've been told I was Muslim by Muslims before because I believe in objective morality. Because but I don't believe a God exists. So how could I be a Muslim? Like, I don't accept that doctrine is true. So okay, I try to live a moral life. I mean, and atheists will disagree. I don't care. Max says Jesus was Asian. Maybe that's like technically correct, but like to say
Sure.
like somebody's African because they're in a continent is sort of, I think, a little reductive. Like hey, here's one. Get this, Issa. Jesus was human.
That's true. I agree. I think
Yeah,
Jesus is Asian. I think those are all fair.
yeah, they are.
Jesus is Asian. Jesus is human. There's nothing wrong with that. I think people
No,
want people to be in their camp. No, they're like, my camp. Jesus is a Muslim, and I'm like, okay, well, Jesus is a Christian. Jesus is a Jew. Jesus is a human. Jesus is an Asian. You can make all of these positions, and in some way, you could argue they're true, but what good does that do you? It doesn't really get us to a better collaborative understanding of things.
and so apparently Max has experienced this before too. That some Muslims will say that we signed a contract before being born with God.
Yeah,
I don't.
I
I've
can
heard
explain
that.
what that is. It's a Lahul
That's what.
Mahfuz. It's the
Okay.
guarded tablet. So there's this idea in Islamic thought, part of the whole Islamic experience, that there was this beginning called a place called there's different worlds. You have Alamul Arwa, you have the Dunya, and then you have Alamul Akhirah, like the world to come. So the Alamul Arwa is like the world before this world. So it's like the spirit world where we all kind of choose who our parents are, we choose all of the stuff, and there's a certain kind of accountability and responsibility that comes from that. Yeah, and that's an argument. But the problem again is like, what does that look like? How do you define that?
Yeah.
It depends on each person. And it's the same thing. Like people say, well, people are born Muslim. I've heard this argument over and over again. It is a fallacious argument. It doesn't make sense because that's not Islamic doctrine. Even like classical traditional doctrine, where it's coming from is that people have a fitra. What is a fitra? A fitra is an innate disposition, an innate disposition to good. It does not mean you are a Muslim. Because the thing is, you have to have some. You can't just conflate everything. You know what I mean? So if a Muslim is a person who prays 5 times a day, fasts, does a shahada, does bears witness, makes prayers, gives alms, goes to pilgrimage in Mecca. If we're defining that as a Muslim, you can't say everybody is that thing.
Right.
But it's like, I think that's a big problem. We see a conflation of terms, and I don't think it works, personally.
I don't either. Like I identify myself. I've had this argument before, or I've seen this argument before with T Jump argues that it's immoral to force somebody to do something against their consent, and requiring people to eat violates their consent. Starvation violates their consent. So, but then people argue, well, what about maybe we signed a contract before we came to Earth to consent to all this stuff, but and T Jump's like, oh yeah, okay, that would work. But then part of that consent things means you should be able to revoke consent anytime. So if I'm not able to revoke consent, even if I agree to not revoke consent, I don't think you can do that. I don't think you could ever agree. Like, imagine that was how sex worked, right? Like if before you begin having sex, you agree to have sex, but you also said, but I also agree not to revoke consent during sex. And then the person is in pain and wants to stop. And you said, but you agreed in the beginning that you can't revoke consent. So
I agree with
I'm not
you.
going to stop.
I
Yeah.
agree with
So
you. I agree with you. I think that's insanity. And the problem too, let's make that argument there was a contract before. We don't know what that contract is. So how can
yeah.
humans then define what that contract is? See, this is a problem. We're using magical thinking. I'm going to call it that. Supernatural magical thinking. If we're going to use that context, and I see philosophers try to engage magical thinking and try to make it sound like it's logical and reasonable. I've had debates where I said, well, we can't prove God exists. We have faith that God exists. But people are like, no, I can prove God exists. I'm like, no, you cannot. No one can prove God exists. You can believe God exists, but what would your test be? He said, well, I can use, I could do Jake the metaphysician thing where I can, say, hey, well, here's these logical premises, and thus through these premises, God exists. I'm like, that's ridiculous. Come on now. What you're doing is you're just trying to sound smart. You can't actually do it. Let's just make it simple, you know.
Right.
And I think it's just so silly when people see logically, rationally. Yeah, what did that person say, that we were born Muslim? Yeah,
Yeah.
that it doesn't. It's not true. So were we born Jewish? Were we born Christian? Were we born Canaanite? Were we born Amalekite before we were born? But we get converted to Mormon after we die. That's cute. That's cute. But I just think these are silly things that people. And I was just in a Discord voice chat today, and people were like, you know, Jesus was a Muslim because he submitted. I'm like, people really believe in this dumb argument. It's so bad. It just doesn't work. It just falls apart right when pull some strings from it. And then they're like, you know, it's just such a bizarre situation of how people are engaging this. But with this particular debate, I'm excited to see what's going to happen. I just kind of know what Daniel's going to do, and I'm just going to be like, like what Captain Picard does in Star Trek, where he face palms. I'm going to be doing that a lot. I'm sure you will too.
Yeah, we'll see.
Of
I'm looking forward to it, though. See how Daniel handles it. It's running late to 5 minutes, but this makes sense with these two guys. Max points out, and I hate this argument too. If you want to be pricky, I think he means about it. We were all born atheists, and then we learn or not a religion. I think atheism and theism is about belief, and you aren't born with beliefs or lack of beliefs.
I agree.
Like, you have to be able to contemplate the proposition to be able to form a belief, not a belief against it, belief for it, or a lack of belief towards the claim. So I would never say that rocks are atheists, or seems to be some fundamental contradiction to say that something is in the category of belief. So it seems to be like a category error fallacy to say a baby has a belief or a lack of belief.
I agree. So. I agree. I think all of that's on point. I think the thing is, it's really hard to, because like in reality, can we truly be authentically theist or atheist? I think what we can do is we're really stuck actually in agnosticism in general, is that we really just don't know. We're talking about something we have no idea about. We live life as God does exist, or we live life as God doesn't exist, or we live somewhere in between where sometimes God exists, sometimes God doesn't exist. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people like that too, So it's like we just don't know. We have no idea, and it's okay. You just make it. You can say, well, this is where I stand. I just don't have the evidence, or it doesn't work for me. Or some people say, hey, this is super important and integral in my life, and I think both of those positions are fair. That's where I would stand on that. What do you think? Do you think that's a fair?
Yeah, I mean, if you use the actual like philosophical definition for knowledge, which is a justified true belief, so it means you have a belief, something you hold is true, that is in fact true. And so the problem that you've justified, so it has to be justified from premises that you know for a fact are true. And there's an epistemic problem with that. Like you can never there's a problem with hard solipsism. So you can never really get from, if you hold to justified true belief, you can never have justified true belief, so you can never have knowledge. So by that definition, you should be agnostic about everything. I don't hold to that definition. I hold to JTB plus, which is through pragmatism, through fallibility. I would say I can have knowledge, pragmatic knowledge, that something is true, that's justified based upon axioms that I just accept are true, because axioms are not justified by definition.
I dig that. I think what you're saying pretty much the same thing. It's like we live life as these things work. They're workable equations. We make them work. That's how we live our life. Whether we know for sure or not, it doesn't really matter. Who cares? This is what is functional and helps me live from my daily functions, my activities of daily living. Right? That's it.
But I would say we can have beliefs, and we can hold a proposition to be true as long as we are justified in the proposition. We're rational. And there's nothing wrong with beliefs based upon feelings. Like, I believe I love this person because I feel the love for that person. So you can form a deductive. If I feel love for a person, then I can know I love the person. Like, that's logically consistent. There's nothing wrong with that.
I'm with that. I have no problem with that. I think it's totally cool. I think that people this is my big problem in religious dialogues in general, is that people are too big for their bridges, or too big for their pants. That's like a British saying, right? They really are talking out of a place they really just don't have any expertise or any knowledge of. Like, for example, when people argue, is religion scientific? I'm like, this is ridiculous. You don't have a scientific background. And if you do, you're going to manipulate your knowledge of science to fit the religious background. You probably are not an expert in both. So the person who may be religious, like a practitioner of religion, but is a scientist by trade, will manipulate their understandings of science to fit the religious narrative.
Okay.
Right?
Debate started. So
it is?
thank you.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Adianto.
You should get redirected, but I'm going to end it now. Thank you for coming. We'll have an after show after the debate.
I will be there.
Thanks.